Hey, friends, this episode is something that we never expected to happen, but we're so glad that it did. So, today we're sitting down with Chris McKinnell, the grandson of Ed and Lorraine Warren. Yes, the Warrens behind cases like Amityville, the Perrin family, Annabelle, the Conjuring universe, all of it. So, Chris has spent his life investigating the real stories behind the horror movies, confronting entities most of us wouldn't dare speak about, and carrying forward the legacy of two of the most well known and controversial figures in paranormal history. Nothing is off limits in this conversation, so we'll talk about what really happened in the Smurl haunting, what's real and what's not in the movies, growing up around haunted objects, and so much more. This isn't a movie. This is the truth behind the stories. So, welcome to Chasing Midnight. We have some basic questions that we have prepared. Now, you are welcome to go off on tangents. You're welcome to do your own thing. This is pretty casual.
You'll find that I go off on tangents very easily, so you might have to in.
Look, we're recommending that.
Yes.
We're recommending it. Whatever you've got to say, go for it. So the new film, The Conjuring: The Last Rite, is set to release this September. And from our understanding, it's based on the Smurl family investigation, which is a case that you were deeply involved in, right?
I was involved in. I won't say deeply. I was there, I think, 3 weekends. My grandfather sent me out there. By this time, he wasn't doing hands-on investigations very often.
Okay.
He sent us young folks out to do that.
I can't blame him. But will we see a character based on you in this new movie? Or is this going to be, focusing on Ed and Lorraine mostly?
Honestly, I know you won't see me because in the movie universe, my mother is still a teenager, I think.
Oh,
So that's not likely unless she had some immaculate cloning as a baby. And I wouldn't put it past the Conjuring universe, but no, I won't be a part of it. And I want to warn people, if you're watching these things expecting a documentary, you're not getting that. This is pure Hollywood fantasy. Yes, there are real stories or real cases behind them, but none of the details are real.
so in that case, are they accessing any kind of files that have the information, or is all of this just basically fiction?
They have access to stories that have been told to them,
Okay.
but how accurate those stories are. And honestly, once you sell your rights to Hollywood, Hollywood can do anything they want with it. The most overused marketing tool in the world is based on true events or inspired by true events. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
How much of this new movie do you expect to be factual, and how much do you anticipate it to be fiction?
I have no idea what's going to be in this movie, but if it's anything like Conjuring 2 and 3, I would guess 5%, 10% is going to be factual.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I mean, for instance, in Conjuring 2, they somehow combine Amityville and Enfield when there was no connection. James Wan came up with, he needed a monster to combine those two cases. And he came up with Valak. He came up with the Nun. None of that is inspired by any reality whatsoever.
Okay. So, growing up around Ed and Lorraine, did you spend time in the artifact room? And if you did, is there anything in there that specifically sticks with you or still haunts you to this day?
Being locked in there when I was 3 years old at night.
Ah,
Yeah, that scarred my childhood pretty terribly. I was
I can
terrified of
imagine.
the dark until I went on my first case with my grandfather when I was 16. Up until then, I was sleeping with the light on, having night terrors, and he made me face my fears. And honestly, that one night was the most phenomena-filled poltergeist experience I've ever been through. No other case I've ever worked on has been as over the top Hollywood-like as that first night. And after that, I was never afraid of the paranormal again. It was my baptism by fire.
Yeah. Do you remember any details about that night? Or any stories or anything that you
Everything,
want to share?
everything.
Oh my
But
gosh.
for your audience, I was 16. I was just about to start my last year of high school, and my grandfather called me out of the blue. Had no idea he had ever thought of doing this. And he said, "Chris, I want you to come on a case with me tonight." I was like, "Oh,
Oh.
oh." But my mother hates the paranormal. She's never had anything to do with it. She's not psychic. She doesn't allow her husband to have anything to do with the paranormal. He's never been on a case in his life, but my mother allowed me to go, maybe to please her father. I don't know. And he showed up. We got to this house. It's a little tract home in Lee, Massachusetts. And the husband and wife were sitting outside the house. They would not go in without us because previously they had inherited this house from the man's uncle. And a little boy spirit, all dressed in white, appeared the first night that they were in the house. And they were in bed. And it said from the bedroom door, "Where do all the lonely people go?" And the wife, who had converted from Judaism, she was very devout. She got a hold of her local priest. He came in, he did a blessing, and that child never returned. But
Oh.
it was replaced by this hulking black shape. And we have a photo of it. But the man had to go to work at the mill overnight. He worked a rotating shift. And so the woman and her two girls were in the house. The girls were in two separate bedrooms across the hall, a really tiny place. And this hulking black shape came into the bedroom, picked up the rosary beads on the woman's bed, and twirled them as if to say, "You think these are going to stop me?" The woman raced out of the room as quick as she could. As she was trying to get to open the first girl's door, the door wouldn't open, and there were no locks on the doors. And then the pull down stairs to the attic came smashing down on her head, knocking her to the ground, senseless. Once she finally came to her senses, she was able to immediately open the door and get them out. But they were terrified. All sorts of things were flying around, chairs and tables and pots and pans. They had to remove most of the things that were in the house. I think they got rid of the refrigerator as well. There were no tables in there. The stove was still there. And there was a couch and a recliner downstairs, and the beds were upstairs, and nothing else really. But when we got there, as soon as we entered, and it was an August night, it was a beautiful night. As soon as we got in there, the whole house was shaking from the pounding in the walls in repetitions of 3. And my grandfather, being a good Catholic man, he immediately assumed this meant it was demonic. It's an insult to the Trinity. I don't agree with that anymore. I did then, though. I believed anything he said back then. As we were going up the stairs, the walls were shaking. And you could hear growling and clawing coming out of the wall.
Gosh.
I looked at the top of the stairs, I looked to my left, and there was a giant crucifix on the wall in the bathroom. And it was turned upside down, like right out of a Hollywood movie.
Oh my goodness.
Crap. And then the stairs to the attic had been pulled down. They were just like sitting there waiting for us. No.
It's an invitation. Come on.
My grandfather said, "Chris, I want you to go in the master bedroom and sit in the dark and wait for something to happen. We're going to go downstairs and we're going to use religious provocation and Holy Church incense to make this thing reveal itself." I'm thinking, you need to reveal it more? What more do you need? But, my grandfather had tried to join the Marines at 16 when he was in World War II. And the day he turned 17, I think he joined the Navy. So I was like, all right, I'm going to do what he tells me to do. I'm not going to look like a coward to my grandfather.
Yeah.
And I'm listening to all of these things going on, and I'm like, Gramps, I hear this. Like, okay, Chris, let us know if anything else happens. I'm like, they smudged downstairs, but every time they tried to get this kitchen pot full of holy church incense up the stairs, it would go out. Now, this is stuff, once it's lit.
Yeah.
And it would not stay lit. After about an hour, the other man that had come with us, my grandmother wasn't there that night, but the other man that was with us, his name was Paul Bartz. He came and he took my place, and I gratefully went downstairs. At midnight, we were on a radio show called, on WTIC AM radio with Brian Dow. And we were doing it on the phone. I was in the recliner. My grandfather and the lady were on the couch off to my left. The husband and Paul Bartz were upstairs in one of the girls' rooms on the phone. And we were listening while the family and my grandfather were talking on the radio. It was pitch black, no lights on at all. At 3 a.m., all hell broke loose.
Oh my God.
Two of those big black shapes came down the stairs and stood on the landing near the front door. Even in the dark, you could see them. That's how black they were.
Wow.
At about 3:15, the woman screamed that her face was on fire. And my grandfather put the flashlight on her face, and we watched 3 claw marks appear on the left side of her face and blood drip onto her chest. Then that pot that had the church incense in it flew out of the kitchen, around the corner, and straight at my head. I was sitting there with that same crucifix that had been upstairs in the bathroom.
Mhm.
And under my breath, I've got phone in one hand, the crucifix in the other hand, and under my breath, I'm doing what my grandfather told me to do. By the power of Jesus Christ, I command you to be gone. By the power of Jesus Christ, I command you to be gone. I was terrified out of my mind. And this pot flew through the air, hits the window behind me. The shade flew up. I said, "Oh," over the radio. The pot crumpled, and the window didn't break. Physically impossible. Then the woman started screaming she wanted out of the house, and I thought, let me help you.
Walk you out. Come on.
Here, I'll get the door. But when I ran to the front door, which we had been going in and out of, it would not open. The lights are now going on and off. And that recliner I had just been sitting in 10, 15 seconds earlier tumbled across the room at me. And then the door opened by itself, and she and I got out, leaving my grandfather sitting there calmly telling everybody what's going on. The bravest thing I've ever seen in my life, honestly. We had Father McKenna. He had later became Bishop McKenna, but at the time, Father McKenna came in. He did a house cleansing, and everything was fine for quite a while. But then in May of 1982, just before I was about to graduate high school, and I was already taking college classes at the University of Connecticut, which is important, we got a call. So my grandparents, both of them this time, and I went back up there. They were having fires appear on the glass covers of photos on the walls, family photos. And the woman had been downstairs in the basement doing laundry. And she felt this sharp, piercing pain in her top of her head. And she pulled out what looked like two fangs or claws. They looked like 2 claws out of her head. And I asked, well, can I have these? I want to take them to the University of Connecticut zoology department and see, what this is.
Yeah.
So I did that, and it turned out they weren't claws at all. They were the first premolar of a 1 to 2 year old domesticated pig that had been broken in half, and the roots of the tooth that looked like claws had been the part that was shoved into the top of her head. Remember, I said she had been Jewish. And there's a prohibition in the Jewish religion against pigs.
Yeah.
And my grandfather took that as just another jab at her and her beliefs. And at the time, I didn't know enough to ask any other kinds of questions. We were just using Catholicism as our lens of understanding. I've learned since then we can't do that. Religion can be a wonderful tool working with or against the paranormal, but you should never investigate through that lens. I think mankind, we are storytellers. We're uncomfortable with the unknown. We have to put a name on everything, even if the name is the devil, because the devil is better than the unknown. The devil I can understand, therefore I can fight it. The unknown, that's too big.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for anybody who's dealing with this, don't jump to conclusions, please. Chances are very good you're never going to deal with this kind of thing that I just related to you. And it's probably just the old man that used to live in the house trying to get your attention.
So I guess you kind of answered my next question. Were your grandparents ever protective over you when it came to their work, or were they always like real encouraging to explore the paranormal?
Oh, my grandmother in particular was very protective. Very. My grandfather, not so much. He was a joker. I'd be 4 years old and going down into his Halloween room in the basement, and he'd have rubber bats falling on my head to terrify me.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yeah. But my grandmother, on the other hand, I remember after her dad died, I was afraid to stay with my great grandmother. And I said I was afraid of ghosts. And my grandmother lied to me, and she said, "Don't worry, honey, there's no such thing as ghosts." Lorraine Warren said that to me. The only time she ever lied to me. And so, no, she was very protective of me.
Did your grandparents ever express any doubts, like whether what they were doing was too dark or dangerous?
No, I can honestly say they didn't. They changed their views over time. And that's something I try to get across to people. I love when people quote something back to me from the demonologist, from 1975. I was like, they were still learning back then. And you're really only seeing a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
If you're going to learn from my grandparents, you can't learn from the old videos or their books, especially their books, because their books were all written by somebody else.
Oh.
But you have to look at it as a snapshot in time. This is what we believed then. I grew up thinking that rock and roll was satanic because that's what my grandfather taught me. I missed out on all the good stuff until I was in college. And he changed. In the 80s and 70s, he thought witchcraft and Satanism were synonymous. It wasn't until later that he learned better. And we used to have knockdown, drag out arguments over psychology being important. He couldn't stand it because in the 70s, he had to deal with parapsychologists and he couldn't stand them. He didn't like the way they did their work. He thought it was ridiculous. And I wanted to bring psychology in because I felt that was an important component in making somebody spiritually strong as well. It took time, but by the 90s, sure, he was there. He was with me on that. So you need to understand, they didn't have mentors. They were the mentors. They They gave me their knowledge. They didn't have anybody doing that for them. Even their first 6 years investigating hauntings, they didn't believe in demons at all. And then in the 70s and 80s, they kind of went the other way, especially my grandfather. And everything was demonic, especially during the satanic panic of the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So they were human. They were learning all the time, and they were smart enough to adapt and change. So people need to understand that when they're looking at these things. When they hear my grandparents tell one story and then tell a different version of the story, well, you work on 10,000 cases and see if you can get them all right. I've worked 10,000. And honestly, I couldn't even begin to tell you 9,500 of them.
Was there a case that made them question continuing their work that they may have refused to work on because it felt too risky?
No, not really. No, I can't think of any. They had trouble with the first Conjuring case, the Perrin case.
Mm-hmm.
They had never dealt with anything that difficult up to that point. It took 10 years. It wasn't like the movie.
Yeah.
So I think that was the one that was an eye opener for them. They never talked about that case with me, not once. In all our years, I never heard them mention that case.
Why do you think that is? They just wanted to protect you, or they just mentally did not want to go back there?
Probably because they didn't do a very good job with it, and it wasn't the kind of thing they wanted to re-examine again and again. You know,
Yeah.
and I understand that. You know, the truth is, back in the day, we had about a 50% success rate. We weren't doing it as effectively as today. Today, if the family is willing to work with us and make whatever changes are necessary for them, then we have a very high success rate. I would say in reality, even when they don't cooperate, we're probably at about 75%.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's because we look at the underlying issues that make somebody vulnerable to a haunting, and we deal with those. We deal with people holistically. We can't just wave a magic wand or do a spiritual cleansing and everything's going to be hunky-dory.
Mm-hmm.
You need to figure out why this family, what's happening in that family that needs to be taken care of so that they don't keep opening that door again.
What are your thoughts on the Warren Occult Museum today? Do you believe that the objects in it still hold power?
Yes, it's energy. I believe in quantum physics. And I think you can infuse something with negative energy or positive energy. I think that's what a relic can be, something beautiful and powerful, but because of the faith and energy that people have put into it. Without that, it's meaningless.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes things can be suffused with some pretty terrible energies. That was never supposed to be a museum. It was never open to the public. It was always by special invitation.
Mm-hmm.
It was a prison, a place to protect people from those things. My grandfather put a big sign on Annabelle, positively do not open.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and now it's all being taken out on tour. It's crass, it's a money grab, and it's terrifying to me because even if these are not the actual items, which I believe they probably are, but even if they aren't, there are enough people who are psychologically vulnerable who
So they
can
still hold
believe
power.
that they're being influenced and can hurt themselves. Look, my family will never speak to me again because I've made this public stand. But my code of ethics is more important to me than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
The safety of the public is all that matters to me.
Is there a case, not necessarily the most famous, but one you felt was the most real, legitimate, or like truly terrifying?
For me personally,
Mhm.
my first case. But,
Oh.
you know, but I've had some beautiful cases. I mean, truly touching, warm, heartbreaking cases. More often than not, really. Even when things are over the top crazy, like poltergeist phenomena, you'd be surprised how many times it's because we're dealing with out of control psychics who don't know what they're doing, and their anxiety builds up, and all of a sudden, pots and pans are flying across the room, chairs and tables are sliding, and it's just people.
Yeah.
And if you help those people, everything's going to be fine.
If the general public knew some of the things that you know about, like demons, possession, or anything in the spirit world, what do you think would scare people the most?
Well, first, let's redefine things. There are no such thing as demons, as far as I'm
Okay.
concerned. All right. Yes, I know. Grandson of the demonologist. I was called a demonologist by my grandfather when I was 22. I gave that up when I was 26. I've lived all over the world. I've lived in 106, 107 places now. And what I have learned is these things manifest according to our own cultural and spiritual beliefs, our own perception. When you're faced with the unknown, you will give the unknown a face. And that is what it will become for you. Whether it's Beelzebub or a Hindu demon or a jinn, it's according to your belief system, or perhaps the belief system of somebody who lived there previously, who already manifested it.
Yeah.
But yes, those things can be deadly. I've lost 2 people to possession. 2 people were killed. And my grandfather had a heart attack during the exorcism of a man named Maurice Theriault. I was there protecting the bishop who was doing the exorcism. I was standing between the 2 of them. And my grandfather was off to the side complaining he didn't feel well. And my grandmother looked right at him and said, "Oh, Ed, why don't you have a banana? You're probably low on potassium." She couldn't see he was having a heart attack.
Oh.
As good a psychic as she was, she couldn't see that. It's an important thing I try to teach everyone. Never, ever change your life because of something a psychic tells you. Somebody comes into your house and says, "Oh, you got a demon, we can't help you." Shut up, get out. Do not believe that crap, right? If somebody says, "Oh, you've got an attachment," or "You've got a portal in your basement," yeah, prove it. Show me the evidence that makes me want to believe that. That's anytime. And I'm a psychic. I think I'm a fairly good psychic. But I don't trust me without evidence. The Annabelle, for instance. The whole story of Annabelle Higgins being this little girl who had been killed out in front of the house and was just searching for somebody to love her. And this is, supposedly the spirit that gets attached to the doll, the Raggedy Ann doll, Annabelle. That was all made up by a medium who I believe she believed it herself. She was wrong, but she gave a story to these 2 young nurses who owned the doll. And that made them love it even more and pour more energy into it. And that doll started to act like a little girl. It would move from place to place in the house playing hide and seek. It would leave messages in crayon on parchment paper like, "Want to play? Miss me?" But as they started to get creeped out, as they started to feel like they were being watched all the time, the energy they fed the doll became negative. And messages started to become darker, like, "Help me." And then one afternoon, one of the boyfriends was sleeping on the couch. And he wakes up and he says, "I just had a dream. Annabelle was crawling on top of me and then choking me to death." And he got up, he walked across the room to where Annabelle was sitting in a chair, picked it up and threw it across the room and said, "You're a stupid doll. You couldn't hurt anyone."
Oh my gosh.
And it lashed out as though it was a child who had been hurt. It started shaking the whole house and banging the walls, and the chair rocketed across the room, and the young man was clawed across the chest. And that's when they called a priest, and the priest happened to know my grandfather and grandmother. This was before they were famous.
Yeah.
And they immediately agreed to go in and check it out. Now, my grandparents, being Catholic, my grandfather couldn't believe a child could ever attach itself to a doll. God wouldn't allow that. And my grandmother, when she felt all that negative energy, her interpretation was, oh, it's a demon. That's how she taught me. And for a long time, anytime I felt something heavy like that, that's what I believed as well.
Yeah.
Today, I just believe, no, it's negative energy. It's heavy, dirty, bad energy. But this is known as an egregore. Well, in reality, a tulpa, because a tulpa is a spirit created through the energy of one or two people. And it can take on a life of its own, like a poltergeist would. Normally, it's done through discipline and it's done properly, and it has a job to do, and then it dissipates. This is done by Tibetan Buddhists, monks. But when it's done unintentionally, by accident, that's where you get these out of control hauntings.
You were talking about you being a psychic and stuff like that. Do you believe everyone has the ability to connect with the paranormal, or is it just something only a few people can tune into?
I think it's kind of like anything else. Anybody can pick up a basketball and try to throw it through a hoop. You know, everybody can do that. But not everybody can be Michael Jordan. With practice,
True.
you can get better. You know, you can get better, but you may not ever be world class.
How do you feel about the rise in like ghost hunting shows and paranormal media?
All right, first off, I hate the term ghost hunting. I don't hunt people, and these are just people.
Yeah.
I treat the living and the dead equally. When you die, all that's really happened is your car broke down and you got out. That's it. That's all there is to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a coming home party for the people who die. In normal circumstances, as long as they're passing over, they've got relatives and loved ones waiting for them, like, hey, welcome back. It's good to see you. It's only hard for us. We grieve because we are not going to see them again for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perfectly natural and that's fine. Just remember that when you're grieving for you. You're not grieving for them. They're fine. You know, I think these programs are incredibly misleading. Some are far worse than others. One mass offender is Ghost Adventures. Watch it as entertainment and you're fine. But always understand that's all you're watching. If you did any of the things that you, and I unfortunately know many, many teams who think they've learned by watching Ghost Adventures, that you're not. What you're doing is you're making a lot of mistakes, and then you're going in and you're sharing those mistakes with vulnerable families and terrifying them.
Yeah.
Your first responsibility going into a home should be to minimize the fear, to educate, to help people to understand and give them tools to take back their home. That's what you do first.
What are
good.
some common misconceptions that you hear about your grandparents or even just your family in general?
It's far too many to recount, honestly. I mean, the stories have evolved over the years and it's a little silly. I remember in middle school, I was the strange kid who had grandparents who believed in ghosts. Then the Amityville happened and everybody's, oh, they're all frauds. You know, the thing about Amityville that people don't seem to know, my grandparents were only there one day. They were brought in by Channel 5 News. They were not there by themselves. Every photo you see in that house with my grandparents was taken by a news photographer, including the famous ones like the ghostly child looking from the bedroom door. Some people online have said that's me. Now there's recent stories of them being groomers and pedophiles, and that my grandfather locked my grandmother in the basement, abused her. Let me tell you something. Anybody touches my grandmother, I'm putting them in the ground. And I was a child abuse investigator and family therapist for 7 years. There's
Wow.
no way I was going to put that kind of thing from anybody. And
Hmm.
you've already seen, I've gone against my family just to warn the public about Annabelle. If my grandfather and grandmother were like that, I would not be proudly, continuing their legacy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to go in that, can you tell us more about the Warren Legacy Foundation? How did it come to be? What's its purpose? What do you hope that people take away from its work?
Sure. After the first Conjuring movie came out, we were getting nailed, hammered with requests from all over the world for help because everybody now knew where they can come for help.
Hmm.
And now my grandfather had started an organization called the New England Society for Psychic Research in 1952. But I thought, Graham, people in Mongolia have never heard of New England, but they've heard of Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Hmm.
I want to continue your name and spread it around the world. I've been in the Peace Corps in West Africa. I'd worked with volunteers and several other jobs. And I wanted to find good, qualified people. This was kind of a reaction to all of the stupid paranormal TV shows and the YouTube videos. I wanted to help people out of the darkness. I didn't want to keep dragging them into more fear.
Hmm.
And I shared this idea with my grandmother, and she loved it, loved it. And so that's how it got started. It originally was supposed to be part of NESPER. It was supposed to be the international arm. But Tony Spirit did not like that idea. He didn't want the competition, I suppose. He said, this is my time. I don't want you to do anything until I die. And I was like, Tony, you've never been on a case in your entire life. I've been doing this since I was 16. I'm not going to stop helping people just because you want to be famous. So, we went our separate ways.
So the way that and I think this is kind of funny, the way that we got in contact with you was we had somebody with the name Chris Warren reach out and say that they were the nephew of the Warrens and they'd love to interview and they could get Miss Judy on an interview and it was this whole thing. So I reached out to you hoping that you could also interview along with them. And so I mean, how often does that happen that people impersonate being a family member or they impersonate working for the foundation? And how do you feel about that?
Yes, it's happened a few times, both working for the foundation supposedly and saying that they're family members. Anybody whose name is Warren, I promise you they are not a family member. That wasn't my grandparents' last name. That was my grandfather's first name, Warren Edward Miney. And
Oh.
he didn't like the name Miney and he preferred the name Ed to the name Warren. So he became Ed Warren. Uh, it bugs me a lot. People all over the world are becoming rich and famous using my grandparents' name to, create fake museums and all sorts of things all over the world. I don't charge to help people. I don't, I keep everybody's information confidential. Yes, if there's a book out there about the case or if you've come forward about your own case, I feel it's okay to talk about it.
Hmm.
But otherwise, I'm going to anonymize the details to the point where I'm not going to expose you to that. Because I've seen things like the Smurl case where they went through hell with the public.
Hmm.
And I don't ever want to put somebody in that position. I treat each of my clients almost like a patient and I protect their confidentiality. I'm not in this to be rich. I'm not in this because I like the paranormal. I don't. Because there's a need.
Finally, what's something no one ever asked you that you wish they did in your interviews?
Is there anything personal that you'd like people to understand about your experience, your work, or even just you as a person?
Well, I suppose the most important thing, don't be afraid of what you don't understand. Go into this with some humility, and just because you're hearing something or seeing something or feeling something, judge it by the consequences. Okay, fine. A coffee pot flew across the room and smashed against the wall. Whoopee. Did it hurt you? No. It a spirit does not have fine motor control. If they're so desperate to get your attention that they throw a pot against the wall, then they're just desperate more often than not. Or you're dealing again with a psychic with out of control abilities or something of that nature. I've been in a bed that flew across the room with two people on it and smashed down and broke into pieces. My reaction was to laugh my ass off because I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever experienced. But my cousin, on the other hand, who was in the sleeping bag next to me, made like the road runner and left smoke rings as he got out of there. And the thing is, it was a 10-year-old boy who was upset that we had taken his bed that night. And it was his mind that did it, because this had been a poltergeist case. The energy was still there, dormant. But for 2 years, nothing had happened. And then after that night, nothing ever happened again. It was a one-time occurrence.
Wow.
So I think the thing I'd like to leave people with is go into this with wonder, not with fear, and you'll get a lot farther. Go in with humility. Be comfortable with the unknown, and you'll be far better off. Do not try to communicate with spirits. Don't use spirit boxes, Ouija boards, pendulums, or anything else with the express understanding that you're trying to communicate with spirit. If you are in a bad place in your mind, if you're a anxious teenager full of energy, you're going to attract the wrong attention. Because as my grandmother put it, like attracts like. You put out positive energy, you will get something positive. You put out negative, that's what you're going to attract. And learn to set spiritual boundaries, just like you set personal boundaries. You know, like, oh, you're too close to me, please back up. Do the same thing with a spirit. Every single religion, every single spiritual path in the world has different ways of setting spiritual boundaries. And all it really is saying to another soul, look, no, I'm not allowing you to do that. You cannot bother me in my home. Stop. And if you do that with respect and without fear, but firmly, you'll be much better off in dealing with a haunting.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So we still can't believe that we got to sit down with Chris McKinnell today, someone who's lived through the stories that most of us only hear in whispers. From cursed objects to what really happened behind the Conjuring, this conversation is one that we'll be thinking about for a long time.
If you want to learn more about the work Chris is doing, check out the Warren Legacy Foundation for Paranormal Research at warrenlegacy.com. You can also follow Chris on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with his investigations and teachings.
As always, if you like this episode, leave us a review, share it with your bravest friends, and follow us on socials at Chasing Midnight Pod. We'll be back next week with another story to keep you up past midnight.
Until then, night, night, love you.
Night, night, love you.
Thank you again.